There's a problem sitting in front of you. Could be a work problem, could be a technical problem, could be something in your personal life, and you're stuck, completely stuck. You've read about it, you've thought about it, you've tried the obvious solutions. Nothing works. You don't even know where to start. This happens to everyone, even the smartest people in the world. But here's the difference. Most people stay stuck. They give up. They say it's too complicated, or I'm not smart enough, or I need more information. Richard Feynman never stayed stuck. Not because he was smarter than everyone else, though he certainly was brilliant, but because he had a trick, a method, a way of attacking problems that seemed impossible. And the beautiful thing about this trick is that it has nothing to do with being a genius. It's not about IQ. It's not about natural talent. It's a process, a systematic way of thinking that anyone can learn. Let me show you exactly how it works. Los Alamos, 1943. The Manhattan Project. The greatest minds in physics are gathered to build the atomic bomb, and they're stuck. There's a calculation they need to make, a crucial calculation about neutron diffusion. The math is incredibly complex. Multiple variables, differential equations, integrals that no one knows how to solve. The senior physicists have been working on it for weeks. Nothing. Then Feynman walks in. He's the youngest physicist there. He looks at the problem, and 20 minutes later, he has a solution. Not an approximate solution, not a computer simulation, an actual analytical solution. Elegant, simple, complete. How? Everyone assumed you needed to solve the complex differential equation. That's what the problem looked like. That's what everyone was trying to do. Feynman ignored the equation entirely. He went back to basics. He asked, what is actually happening here physically? Neutrons are bouncing around. They're scattering. They're being absorbed. What's the simplest way to think about that? And he realized you don't need to solve the equation. You need to understand the physics. And once you understand the physics, the math becomes obvious. You reformulated the entire problem from scratch. Different approach. And suddenly what seemed impossible became straightforward. That's the trick. That's what we're going to explore. Here's what most people do when they face a difficult problem. They start with what they don't know. They focus on the gap. They stare at the confusing part and try to figure it out directly. Feynman did the opposite. He always started with what he absolutely knew for certain, the simplest facts, the most basic principles, things he was 100% sure about, even if those facts seemed irrelevant to the problem, even if they seemed too simple to be useful. Because here's what he understood: every complex problem is built on simple foundations. If you can get back to those foundations, you can rebuild your way to the solution. Let me give you an example from his own life. Feynman was once asked to figure out why a spinning plate wobbles the way it does. Someone tossed a plate in the cafeteria at Cornell, and he noticed the wobble had a particular relationship to the spin. He became obsessed with calculating this relationship, but the equations were messy, complicated. He kept getting lost in the math. Then he stopped. He asked himself, what do I absolutely know for certain here? He knew the plate is spinning. It's wobbling. There's angular momentum. There's centrifugal force. These are basic physics concepts he understood completely. So he started there. He wrote down the simple equations for those basic concepts, and he built up from there, step by step, only adding complexity when he understood each layer completely. And it worked. The problem that seemed impossible became solvable. This is the first principle. Don't start with the hard part. Start with what you know. Build from solid ground. Here's something Feynman did that seemed almost childish, but it was incredibly powerful. Whenever he encountered a problem, he would rewrite it completely in his own words without looking at how it was originally stated. Why? Because the way a problem is presented is often part of what makes it confusing. Someone else chose those words. Someone else chose that framework. Someone else decided which details to emphasize and which to leave out. And their way of thinking about the problem might be the worst way for you to think about it. There's a famous story. Feynman was consulting for a company, and they gave him a technical problem. Pages and pages of specifications, diagrams, technical jargon. He read it once. Then he closed the documents. And he wrote in plain English what he thought the problem actually was. Just a few sentences. We need to do X. The constraint is Y. The goal is Z. When he showed this to the engineers, half of them realized they had been solving the wrong problem. The actual problem was much simpler than what the specifications suggested. This happens constantly. Problems get wrapped in layers of complexity that aren't actually part of the problem. They're just artifacts of how someone else thought about it. Feynman would strip all that away. He'd ask, what is actually being asked here? What's the real question? And often, just restating the problem would make the solution obvious. Try this yourself. Next time you're stuck on something, close whatever you're reading. Take out a blank piece of paper. Write down what you think the problem is in your own words. You'll be amazed how often this reveals that you were confused about the question itself, not unable to find the answer. Feynman had a saying, if you can't solve a problem, there's an easier problem you can solve. Find it. This sounds obvious, but most people don't actually do it. They see a big problem. They try to solve the big problem all at once, and they fail because the big problem is too big. Feynman was ruthless about breaking problems down, not just into smaller pieces, into pieces so small that each individual piece was almost trivially easy. Here's how he described it. The problem seems hard because you're trying to swallow it whole. But if you cut it into small enough pieces, each piece is digestible. And once you've digested all the pieces, you've solved the whole thing. Let me show you a concrete example. During the Manhattan Project, there was a question about how much uranium you could store safely without triggering a chain reaction. Incredibly important question. Incredibly complex calculation. Feynman broke it down. First, ignore everything except how far does one neutron travel on average before hitting another nucleus. That's a simple calculation. Just geometry and density. Second, once a neutron hits a nucleus, what's the probability it causes fission versus just bouncing off? That's a separate question. Look up the cross sections. That's already known. Third, if it causes fission, how many neutrons does it release? That's experimental data. Someone already measured it. Now combine these three pieces. What's the average number of new neutrons created per initial neutron? If that number is less than 1, the reaction dies out. If it's more than 1, it grows. Simple. See what he did? He took an impossibly complex question about nuclear chain reactions and broke it into 3 trivially simple sub-questions, and each sub-question had a straightforward answer. The hardest part wasn't doing the math. It was having the discipline to break the problem down that far. Most people stop too early. They break a problem into 2 or 3 big pieces and then try to solve those big pieces. And they're still stuck. Feynman would break it down 10 times, 20 times, until each individual step was something he could do in his head or in 5 minutes with a calculator. That's the trick. Break it down until it's trivial. If it's still not trivial, break it down more. Here's something that sounds counterintuitive but is incredibly powerful. Feynman often solved problems by assuming he already knew the answer, not guessing the answer. Assuming he knew it, and then asking, if that were true, what else would have to be true? This technique is called working backwards, and it's especially useful when you have no idea how to start working forwards. Let me give you an example from physics, but the technique applies everywhere. Suppose you want to know, why do planets orbit in ellipses? How would you even start solving that? Feynman would approach it like this. Assume the answer is, the force of gravity follows an inverse square law. If that's true, what shape would the orbits be? Now you have a different problem, a calculation problem. Can I derive the shape of orbits from an inverse square law? That's something you can work on. It's math. There are techniques. And if the math gives you ellipses, great. You've confirmed the inverse square law explains the observation. If the math gives you something else, then the inverse square law is wrong. Try a different assumption. This is how Feynman thought about quantum mechanics. The theory was already developed by others, but he wanted to understand it deeply. So he'd assume certain results were true. Then he'd work backwards. If this result is true, what must the underlying mathematics look like? And by working backwards from known results, he'd reconstruct the entire theory in his own way, which gave him insights that the original developers didn't have. You can use this technique for non-mathematical problems too. Stuck on a business problem, assume you've already solved it. What would the solution look like? What properties would it have? What would have to be true for that solution to work? Often, just imagining the endpoint tells you what path to take to get there. This is where Feynman became dangerous, and this is what separated him from everyone else. He questioned everything, not in a cynical way, but in a genuine, curious way. Why do we assume this? Who said this has to be true? What if we did it completely differently? Most problems come with built-in assumptions, constraints that people take for granted, limitations that everyone accepts without thinking. Feynman never accepted anything without thinking about it first. There's a famous example from his work on quantum electrodynamics, the theory that won him the Nobel Prize. Everyone was trying to solve certain equations in a particular way. They'd start with this mathematical framework, apply these techniques, and try to get a result. Feynman looked at this and asked, why are we starting with those equations? Is that the only way to think about what's happening? And he realized you could approach the entire problem differently. Instead of thinking about particles at specific moments in time, you could think about particles taking all possible paths through space-time. This was radical. It went against how everyone thought about quantum mechanics, but it worked, and it worked better than the traditional approach. It gave the same answers, but with much simpler calculations, all because he questioned an assumption everyone else took for granted, that you have to think about particles at specific times. Now, you might not be working on quantum field theory, but this principle applies everywhere. Stuck on a work problem? What assumptions are you making? That it has to be done this way? That you need certain resources? That it takes this long? What if those assumptions are wrong? What if there's a completely different approach no one has tried because everyone assumes it won't work? Feynman would write down all the assumptions explicitly. Then he'd go through them one by one. Do I actually know this is true, or am I just assuming it? Often, he'd find that the thing blocking the solution wasn't actually a real constraint. It was just an assumption that no one had thought to question. Let me give you Feynman's complete problem-solving algorithm, the actual step-by-step process he used. Asterisk, step 1. Write down the problem clearly and completely. Asterisk, step 2. Think very hard. That's it. That's what he wrote in his notebook once. And it's funny, but there's truth in it. The real algorithm is this. Asterisk. First, make sure you understand what's actually being asked. Restate it in your own words. Strip away unnecessary complexity. Ask. Second, ask. Write down everything you know that might be relevant. Not what you think you need to know, what you actually know for certain. Asterisk. Third, break the problem into the smallest possible pieces. If a piece still seems hard, break it smaller. Asterisk. Fourth, solve the trivial pieces first. Don't try to solve everything at once. Solve one tiny thing, then another, then another, then another. Asterisk. Fifth, look for patterns. As you solve small pieces, often you'll see a pattern that tells you how to solve the whole thing. Asterisk. If you're still stuck, question your assumptions. Write down everything you're assuming about the problem. Then ask which assumptions might be wrong. Asterisk. Seventh, try working backwards. Assume you know the answer. What would have to be true? Asterisk. Eighth, if all else fails, try to solve a simpler version of the problem. Then gradually add back the complexity. This isn't magic. It's not genius. It's systematic thinking. It's discipline. And it works. But here's the deepest thing Feynman understood. The thing that made him different from everyone else. He didn't see being stuck as a problem. He saw it as information. Most people feel bad when they're stuck. They feel frustrated, stupid, defeated. Feynman felt curious. Interesting, I'm stuck. Why am I stuck? What specifically is blocking me? What do I not understand? He treated being stuck as a puzzle in itself, a puzzle worth solving. And this completely changed how he approached difficult problems. He didn't avoid them, he sought them out. There's a story from Los Alamos. The military had these filing cabinets with combination locks. Feynman became obsessed with figuring out how to open them. Why? Not because he needed to steal documents, because the problem was interesting. How do these locks work? What are their weaknesses? Can I figure out the combination systematically? He spent weeks on this, testing, experimenting, trying different approaches. And eventually, he could open almost any filing cabinet in Los Alamos, not because he was a master safecracker, because he understood the problem deeply. He wasn't smarter than everyone else. He just refused to give up when he was stuck. He saw being stuck as the beginning of the process, not the end. Let me show you this process in action with a real problem. Here's a classic puzzle that stumps most people. A man lives on the 10th floor of a building. Every day he takes the elevator down to the ground floor to go to work. When he comes back, he takes the elevator to the 7th floor and walks up 3 flights of stairs. Why? Most people start guessing. He wants exercise. The elevator is broken after the 7th floor. He's meeting someone on the 7th floor. None of those work when you think about it. The problem says he does this every day. Let's use Feynman's method. Asterisk step 1. Asterisk state the problem. Someone consistently takes the elevator partway and then walks the rest. Why would someone do this consistently? Asterisk step 2. What do I know for certain? You can take the elevator to the ground floor, so the elevator works completely. He chooses to stop at the 7th floor. Asterisk step 3. Step 3. Break it down. Why would someone stop the elevator early? Either they want to stop the elevator early. Either they have to stop early, or they have to stop early. Ask-4 asked if he wanted to stop early for exercise, to meet someone, etc. Why always the 7th floor specifically? That seems arbitrary. Step 5, asked. Step 5, what if he has to stop at the 7th floor? What would force that? Asterisk. Step 6, question assumptions. Why am I assuming he's able to press the 10th floor button? What if he can't reach it? Asterisk answer. He's too short to reach the 10th floor button. He can only reach up to the 7th floor button. But he can reach the ground floor button, but he can reach the ground floor button because it's at the bottom. See the process? We didn't guess. We systematically eliminated possibilities and questioned assumptions until the answer became clear. That's how Feynman solved everything. Systematically, patiently, without getting frustrated. Different problems need different approaches. Feynman knew when to use which technique. For problems where you don't even know where to start, start with what you know. Build from there. No. Asterisk. For problems that seem too complex, break them down into smaller pieces, ruthlessly. Asterisk. For problems where you keep hitting the same wall, question your assumptions. One of them is probably wrong. Asterisk. For problems where you can't find a path forward, work backwards from the answer. Asterisk. For problems that everyone says are impossible, asterisk. For what everyone is assuming, challenge it. The key is flexibility. Don't get attached to one method. If something isn't working, try a different approach. Feynman was famous for switching approaches mid-problem. He'd try one framework. It wouldn't work. He'd abandon it completely and try something else. No ego, no sunk cost fallacy. Just, that didn't work. What else can I try? Here's what's really happening when you use these techniques. You're not just solving the specific problem in front of you. You're training yourself to think clearly. Every time you break down a problem systematically, you're building the skill of analysis. Every time you question an assumption, you're building the skill of critical thinking. Every time you restate a problem in your own words, you're building the skill of understanding. These aren't separate skills for different domains. They're universal thinking skills. Feynman could jump between physics, biology, computing, art, music, safecracking, because he had these meta skills. He didn't know everything, but he knew how to figure out anything. And that's what these techniques give you. Not solutions to specific problems, but the ability to solve any problem. Here's the uncomfortable truth. These techniques aren't complicated. You could teach them to a child. There's nothing here that requires advanced knowledge. So why don't more people use them? Because they require something most people aren't willing to give: patience. It's faster to guess. It's faster to ask someone else. It's faster to give up and move on. Working through Feynman's process is slow. It feels inefficient. It feels like you're overthinking, but you're not. You're actually thinking. Maybe for the first time. Most people don't think through problems. They react to them. They apply patterns they've seen before. They try obvious solutions, and for easy problems, that works fine. But for hard problems, for problems you haven't seen before, for problems where the obvious solutions don't work, you need to actually think. And Feynman's techniques are a framework for thinking, for systematic, disciplined, patient thinking. That's why they work. And that's why most people never learn them, because they'd rather stay stuck than do the slow work of thinking things through. Let me end with something Feynman said that captures everything I've been trying to explain. Someone asked him, "How are you able to solve problems that no one else can solve?" And he said, "I'm not smarter than everyone else. I just think about things longer. I refuse to give up when I'm stuck. And I'm willing to try approaches that seem stupid at first." That's it. That's the secret. Not genius. Persistence. Willingness to feel stupid. Willingness to start over completely if your approach isn't working. Feynman would spend days on a single problem. He'd fill notebooks with failed approaches. He'd try things that didn't work. But he never interpreted failure as, "I can't do this." He interpreted it as, "That approach didn't work. What else can I try?" And eventually, through sheer persistence and systematic thinking, he'd solve things that seemed impossible. You can do the same thing. Not because you're as smart as Feynman, but because you're as smart as Feynman, but because intelligence isn't the limiting factor. The limiting factor is whether you're willing to work through the process, to start with what you know, to break things down, to question assumptions, to work backwards, to try multiple approaches. That's not talent, that's discipline, and anyone can develop it. Here's what I want you to do. Think of a problem you're stuck on right now, something that's been bothering you, something that seems too hard or too complex. Take out a piece of paper. Write down what you absolutely know for certain about this problem. Then write down what you're trying to figure out. Then ask, can I break this into smaller pieces? What's the simplest version of this problem? Just start the process. Don't try to solve everything at once. Just take the first step, because that's what Feynman would do. He wouldn't stare at the whole thing feeling overwhelmed. He'd write down one thing he knew for certain, then another, and somewhere in that process the solution would emerge, not through magic, through systematic thinking. That's the trick. That's how you solve any problem you don't understand. You start with what you know. You build from there. You break things down. You question assumptions. You work backwards, step by step, piece by piece, until the impossible becomes possible. And then you solve it.